In the search for justice, equality for African Americans has been a pressing issue. The police force has especially been criticized for blocking the road to equality for African Americans. As discussed in class with Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from Birmingham jail, throughout history, the U.S. police force has taken advantage of power to impede upon the journey to justice and equality for people of color. The creation of the police force allows for one to understand the racist values the police force is based upon and what they represent. In the South, the earliest form of policing was made up of slave patrols that ensured control of any enslaved African American. The creation of slave patrol was a form of policing to keep slave labor in place without any issues of rebellion. Slave patrol was used as a fear tactic to keep slaves docile through the brutality of any runaway slave. It was mandatory for any slave patrol to enforce beatings when catching any runaway slaves, and it was considered civic duty that he could be compensated for. The modern U.S. police force is based off of this early form of policing, and the racist values can still clearly be seen. As Martin Luther King Jr. began advocating for civil rights, the pushback from police represented racist beliefs. Martin Luther King Jr. advocated for civil disobedience and correcting unjust laws. He was jailed in Birmingham for his nonviolent direct action. Police brutality became more prominent as police tried to defend the racist laws by enforcing them through using violence as power. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke out against police brutality on multiple occasions, including in his "I Have a Dream" speech, where he stated, "We can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of the unspeakable horrors of police brutality." The police utilized their power during the civil rights era and protests to keep segregation alive through violence. In support of segregation, police enforced the laws created in racism through excessive force. During the civil rights era, fire hoses and dogs were employed to attack nonviolent, peaceful protesters. The police violence was incredibly harmful and hurt many protesters. The brutality of this era was used to try and control the protests and progress of racial equality. The advancement of technology has given police easier access to violent tactics often used more so on people of color in comparison to white people, due to racism which plagues the police. Modern technology of police brutality is used to disperse and harm peaceful protesters. Such technology could include chemical irritants, rubber bullets, and disorientation devices to try and stop nonviolent protests. It also includes guns. This technology is also disproportionately used against people of color compared to white people. Stephon Clark was killed by 8 gunshot wounds out of 20 rounds fired by police for holding his phone in his grandmother's backyard. He was assumed by police to be holding a gun, but this was not the case. Police used excessive force and did not make any attempt to de-escalate the situation. Instead, they escalated it, and in result, Stephon died. In a different instance, Isaiah Malalua was peacefully arrested in full body armor and in possession of a loaded gun in public. In a substation, he was armed and carrying a bag of gear he had stolen from the New York Police Department SWAT team. The contrast in which these similar situations were handled is alarming. Both men were thought to have a gun, and the one without was killed with excessive force in his grandmother's backyard, while the other was peacefully detained in Union Station. Though the Civil Rights era paved the way for historical achievements of justice for African Americans, police brutality among people of color was still rampant among the U.S. police force. Legally, discrimination was no longer allowed, but it did not stop. The Civil Rights Act was passed to end segregation in public places and banned employment discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed, but this did not stop the acts of police brutality. Though this act was passed, the Harlem race riots that ensued shortly after were in response to the shooting of James Cowell by an off-duty police officer. The Harlem race riots were fueled by a mistrust of the police due to racial injustices. Discrimination of race was illegal through this act, but did not change the racial bias ingrained in police officers who continued using excessive force against people of color. This force led to the historical riots and was used to contain them. The murder of Rodney King amplified the excessive police force still in use and led to massive questioning of the U.S. justice system. Rodney King was beaten almost to death, and it was caught on tape. It sparked outrage among African Americans and Los Angeles citizens as they rioted and questioned the integrity of our justice system when the officers involved were acquitted of all charges at first. Police brutality is often met with inadequate justice, and it perpetuates a skewed idea of justice. Many police officers who enforce police brutality do not face charges of any kind. Many officers resign from their positions. This can be seen in instances like Betty Shelby, who shot and killed Terrence Crutchner as she was scared for her life, even though he did not have any weapons on him. Betty Shelby resigned from her position after this terrible incident. She did not face any charges and ended up working for the Tulsa Police Department again the following year. This is a reality of many officers that can use their power simply of being a police officer to avoid facing punishment of police brutality. Modern media has played a major role in documenting police brutality, as well as creating an accessible platform for more people to work together towards racial justice. Media today allows for easy access to become aware of any injustices. The case of George Floyd was spread through mass media and sparked a massive discussion of police brutality, racism within the police force, and ideas of justice. The video of his death was streamed on many media platforms and spread around for many people to use and educate themselves on the death of George Floyd. The use of media allowed for many to educate themselves on the death of George Floyd and also come together through online posts and peaceful protests to pressure justice for George Floyd. The media helped push for justice and added pressure for justice throughout the process of charging the officers who killed Floyd. The notion Martin Luther King Jr. promoted that the people must work together to defy unjust laws during the civil rights movement is still relevant today as people speak out against the institutionalized racism of the police. Martin Luther King Jr.'s notion that unjust laws, like segregation and police brutality, must be met with nonviolent direct action continues to be brought to life today. The Black Lives Matter protests are pivotal to progress towards racial injustice and has led to progress in holding the police officers accountable for their abuse of power. Originally, only one officer faced charges for the murder of George Floyd, but after countless protests and pressure from people around the world, all 4 officers have been charged. Historical progress must be acknowledged in the journey to fight racial injustice to gain equality. As we work towards racial equality, it is important to look back upon the history of racism and police brutality. Martin Luther King Jr.'s contribution to this movement are incredibly important, as his beliefs of addressing unjust laws is relevant in how we are addressing police brutality today. We are on a progressive track to racial equality and must continue to work towards justice.